Francis of Assisi, the man later revered as one of the most beloved saints in history, was not born a saint. Far from it. In fact, his youth was marked by vanity, arrogance, and a reckless thirst for pleasure. Born into a wealthy merchant family in Assisi, Francis grew up surrounded by luxury. His father, Pietro di Bernardone, was a prosperous cloth merchant, and young Francis quickly learned to enjoy the privileges of wealth. As a teenager, Francis was known throughout Assisi not for holiness, but for extravagance. He dressed in the finest clothes, threw lavish feasts for his friends, and roamed the streets with the swagger of one who believed the world was his to conquer. To the people of Assisi, he was a charming troubadour, a lover of songs, wine, and laughter. But beneath that charm, Francis was careless, indulgent, and often cruelly indifferent to the poor who begged outside his father's shop. He lived for the thrill of adventure. War and knightly glory fascinated him, and like many young men of his time, he dreamed of becoming a famous warrior. He mocked humility, despised hard labor, and sneered at the meek. For Francis, life was a stage, and he intended to play the leading role. This was the man who would one day renounce it all. But in his youth, Francis embodied everything contrary to saintliness: pride, excess, and the pursuit of earthly glory.
Francis, in his teenage years, stands in a bustling medieval street of Assisi. He wears bright, expensive garments of silk and velvet, adorned with a feathered cap. Around him, poorer townsfolk look on with envy as he laughs loudly, tossing coins carelessly to his friends while ignoring a beggar reaching out. Inside a candlelit tavern, Francis raises a golden goblet of wine surrounded by fellow revelers. Musicians play lutes in the corner while servants pour more drink. The table is crowded with food, laughter, and disorder. Francis, flushed with wine, throws his arm around a friend, lost in drunken merriment. Francis, dressed in shining but slightly oversized armor, stands before a mirror with a smug grin. He poses like a knight ready for battle, though his expression betrays vanity more than courage. His father watches with mixed pride and concern. In the background, expensive fabrics from the family business hang like trophies. On a quiet Assisi street, a poor friar or peasant humbly bows in prayer. Francis and his friends pass by, laughing at him. Francis, flamboyant in colorful clothes, points mockingly, while the poor man remains serene and humble in his devotion. Late at night, Francis sits alone on a stone balcony overlooking Assisi. The city glimmers in the moonlight, but his expression is distant. Despite the laughter and indulgence earlier, here he looks troubled, restless, yearning for more. His golden goblet sits forgotten beside him. This is the first flicker of emptiness in his soul.
Francis of Assisi's youth had been marked by indulgence, pride, and a thirst for glory. But as with many destined for transformation, the seeds of change were sown in the midst of suffering. The turning point of his life did not arrive as a single thunderclap, but rather as a series of cracks forming in the golden mask he had worn for so long. Beneath the laughter, the music of banquets, and the polished armor he once wore into battle, there was a restlessness in his soul, one he could no longer ignore. Francis had once set out to war, driven by visions of honor and fame. He saw himself becoming a knight, a hero whose name would echo in the halls of Assisi. But war has a way of crushing illusions. He was captured, humiliated, and imprisoned for months. The damp stone walls of the cells stripped away his illusions of grandeur. Instead of a knight's triumph, he tasted defeat and despair. The silence of the prison was louder than any celebration he had ever known. It was here, in weakness and despair, that Francis began to ask himself questions he had never dared before. What am I chasing? What is the worth of my life? When Francis was finally released, he tried to return to his old life. The banquets, the laughter, the wine, and the silks were all waiting for him. Yet something felt different. The jokes were hollow, the music too shallow, and his old friends' laughter seemed strangely empty. What once excited him now left him restless. His soul, once content with the pleasures of the flesh, now recoiled from them. The world had not changed, but Francis had. He was haunted by the memories of prison, by the faces of the wounded, by the emptiness of all his pursuits. The true breaking of Francis's heart came in an unexpected moment, his encounter with a leper. In medieval society, lepers were the outcasts of the outcasts, shunned, feared, despised. Francis himself had once recoiled at their sight. But one day, while riding outside Assisi, he came face to face with one. His instinct was to turn away, but something stronger pulled him forward. Trembling, he dismounted, approached, and embraced the leper. In that embrace, Francis felt something change within him. What had once been bitter became sweet. In the suffering of the leper, he encountered the suffering Christ. Still restless, Francis often wandered to the small ruined church of San Damiano. One day, kneeling before the crucifix, he prayed with tears, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" And then, as though heaven itself spoke, he heard a voice, "Francis, go and repair my house, which you see is falling into ruin." At first, he thought this meant the literal crumbling stones around him. But in time, he realized it was his own soul, and the soul of the church that God was asking him to rebuild. From that moment onward, Francis began to distance himself from wealth, comfort, and his old life. He walked through Assisi dressed simply, his fine clothes exchanged for rags. His friends mocked him, his father grew angry, and society saw him as a fool. Yet Francis felt freer than ever. He had begun to trade the pleasures of men for the treasures of heaven. The man who had once lived for himself now felt called to live for something greater.
The days following Francis's captivity were unlike anything he had ever known. Though he had been released from the Perugian dungeon, the chains that truly bound him were still inside his soul. His body had returned to Assisi, but his spirit remained in turmoil. Once the darling of the city's taverns and noble banquets, Francis now felt alienated from the very pleasures that once thrilled him. He wandered through the narrow cobbled streets of Assisi like a shadow of his former self. The laughter of young men drinking in the inns no longer stirred joy in him, but left a sour taste in his mouth. He watched the grand festivals with their colorful banners and music, yet he felt detached, as though watching life from behind a veil. The emptiness inside him grew heavier by the day. Francis had long imagined himself destined for greatness, perhaps a knight in shining armor, perhaps a lord admired by all. Yet after the battlefield, after the dungeon, after illness had left him weak and broken, he began to wonder, what is greatness? What is life for? Francis lay awake in his chamber, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling. His silk garments now felt heavy, oppressive, mocking his fragility. Night after night, he dreamed of battlefields drenched in blood, of comrades who would never return. When he awoke, his heart pounded with fear and guilt. But one night, something was different. As he tossed in his bed, Francis heard a whisper in his mind. Who can give you more, the servant or the master? The voice echoed as though carried on the wind, yet it seemed to come from deep within him. Trembling, he answered in the stillness, the master. The reply came swiftly, "Then why do you serve the servant?" It was a question that shattered him. His whole life, he had served vanity, wealth, pride, the fleeting approval of men. But what if there was a greater master? What if the one he had ignored all his life, God, had been waiting for him all along? One afternoon, Francis wandered aimlessly through the countryside. His legs, weakened from illness, carried him toward a crumbling chapel on the outskirts of Assisi, the Church of San Damiano. Its walls were cracked, the paint faded, the altar neglected. Few ever visited it anymore. Francis entered, almost by accident, and collapsed before the simple wooden crucifix that hung above the altar. His heart was heavy, and for the first time, tears streamed freely down his face. He whispered almost desperately, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" And then it happened. The silence of the chapel broke with a voice, not from within his imagination this time, but clear, firm, and radiant. From the crucifix itself came words that would change his destiny. "Francis, go and rebuild my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruin." At first, Francis thought it meant repairing the chapel's broken stones. He rose, almost euphoric, convinced that God himself had spoken to him. Francis began to sell some of his belongings to fund the repairs of San Damiano. When he ran out of his own money, he even took bolts of cloth from his father's warehouse to sell, using the coins for the chapel. This act enraged Pietro di Bernardone. The wealthy merchant stormed into the streets, furious, demanding his son return what he had taken. Before the eyes of the whole town, he dragged Francis before the Bishop of Assisi, accusing him of theft and dishonor. But something unexpected happened. Instead of cowering as he once would have, Francis stood tall. Before the bishop, before his furious father, before the citizens who mocked him, Francis stripped off the fine clothes he still wore, silks his father had bought, and laid them on the ground. Standing only in a rough undergarment, he raised his hands and declared, "From now on, I will say only, 'Our Father who art in heaven.' Pietro is no longer my father. God alone is my father." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Pietro stormed away in rage, humiliated. But Francis felt lighter than ever before. The chains of wealth, family expectation, and pride had fallen away. He was free. Having renounced his family's wealth, Francis embraced poverty. He slept in barns, in caves, and under the open sky. He begged for scraps and bread. Yet instead of despair, he felt joy bubbling up inside him. The greatest transformation came when he began tending to lepers. These were the untouchables of society, shunned and despised, forced to live outside the city walls. In his youth, Francis had avoided them with disgust, even throwing stones to keep them away. But now he approached them with compassion. He washed their wounds with his own hands. He ate with them, prayed with them, and called them brothers. One leper, his face eaten away by disease, looked at Francis with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Why do you love us?" Francis simply smiled, "Because Christ loved me first." It was here, among the outcasts, that Francis truly felt at home.
Francis stood in the crowded square of Assisi, the cold wind cutting across his skin. But his resolve was like fire inside his heart. Before him, his father, Pietro, red with fury, trembling with humiliation, demanded that his son return the wealth and garments that he had wasted on the poor and the church. The townsfolk pressed around them, eager for scandal, whispers rustling like dry leaves. Francis, however, felt a strange calm. Slowly, he removed every garment he wore until he stood in nothing but his bare skin, vulnerable before the entire city. The crowd gasped. He lifted his eyes toward the bishop, who spread his cloak to cover him. With a voice unwavering, Francis declared, "Until now,
I have called Pietro Bernardone my father, but from this moment forward, I say with all my heart, Our Father, who art in heaven. The moment became a breaking of chains, the worldly wealth, the burden of ego, the expectations of society, all shattered. A new Francis was born, a man who would embrace poverty as his greatest treasure. Now clad only in coarse rags, Francis wandered through the streets. Once a nobleman's son, known for his fine silks, now he begged for scraps at the doors of the very people who once envied his wealth. Children pointed, mocking his fall from privilege. Merchants sneered at his dirt-stained tunic. But Francis rejoiced. "My Lord was poor, and so shall I be poor," he whispered. His hunger became prayer. His humiliation became joy. Every insult was a reminder that he was free, free from greed, from the chains of reputation, from the endless hunger for gold. Yet as he knelt by the side of the road, sharing a crust of bread with a leper who stank of disease, something astonishing happened. The leper smiled, and in that broken smile, Francis saw the face of Christ. Days turned into months, and Francis, though poor, grew rich in spirit. He wandered through forests and fields, preaching not only to people, but to every creature. One morning, he came upon a flock of birds. Instead of flying away, they circled above him, landing on branches and stones around him. With gentle voice and radiant eyes, Francis spoke. "My little sisters, you owe much to God who clothed you with feathers, gave you wings to fly, and cares for you without sowing or reaping. Sing to him with joy." The birds chirped louder, as if answering his sermon. Farmers nearby stopped their plowing to watch, astonished as nature itself seemed to listen. For Francis, it was proof. All creation was one family under God's love. What began as one man soon drew many. Young men, inspired by his joy and freedom, came to follow him. They cast off their fine clothes, donned the same rough tunics tied with a simple rope, and called themselves the Friar Minor, the Little Brothers. Together, they walked the roads of Italy, singing hymns, begging for their daily bread, and serving the sick and forgotten. Their laughter rang louder than the gold coins of merchants. Their presence softened hearts wherever they went. Francis taught them, "We must be less than all, servants to all. Let us live as Christ lived, without gold, without property, without pride." This brotherhood would grow into one of the most influential religious orders in history. But at that moment, they were simply a handful of joyful wanderers with nothing but faith. In his solitude, Francis often retreated to caves and mountains. He spoke to the wind, the rivers, the stars. He called the sun his brother and the moon his sister. To him, creation was not silent, it was a choir singing to God.
As the sun began to set on the earthly life of Francis, his body weakened, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. The man who once indulged in vanity, pride, and reckless pleasures had now become the humble Poverello, the little poor one. His entire life had transformed into a living testament of grace, forgiveness, and redemption. Francis spent his final days in prayer, surrounded not by treasures or wealth, but by his brothers, the poor, and even the creatures of the earth he loved so dearly. His heart overflowed with gratitude for the forgiveness he had received and the chance to live as an instrument of peace. On his deathbed, Francis whispered the words of reconciliation, to forgive those who wronged, to embrace suffering with love, and to find joy not in possession, but in surrender. In that moment, he was no longer the carefree rebel of Assisi, nor just the founder of an order, but a living reflection of Christ himself.
When he died in 1226, people mourned not with despair, but with awe. For Francis left behind more than just followers. He left a revolution of the spirit. His example showed the world that no matter how flawed one's past may be, redemption is possible through humility, compassion, and faith. His legacy lives on not only in the Franciscan order, but in every act of kindness, every choice of simplicity over excess, and every prayer whispered in love. The once reckless youth of Assisi became a saint whose name continues to inspire generations to turn from darkness to light. Saint Francis of Assisi reminds us all, no soul is beyond redemption, no past too broken for grace. His journey from sin to sainthood stands as one of history's most radiant stories of forgiveness and divine mercy.